side, yeah. So,
Okay, we'll learn about that.
yeah. Yep. But then I gotta take realtor fees out of that.
Oh, well, they're not gonna pocket.
Yeah.
They're thinking about like 3 or something.
1.5%.
Okay, Alex, I'm ready to roll.
Haven't you calculated it all
You?
out yet?
I haven't. I'm just too busy sending documents and,
You could probably just talk to title and say, what am I gonna clear?
I'll find out. I mean, whatever it is at this point, I guess, so.
Yeah.
Okay,
If I can
we're rolling,
always
guys,
play,
so.
I'm fine.
Ready, Alex?
Yep.
Okay. That was an uncomfortable sound. Well, good afternoon. It's Jeff with Arizona United News, and my local channel is Desert Dog Community Watch, and I'm happy to be here with Marc Victor, the lead attorney at Attorneys for Freedom here in beautiful Chandler, Arizona. Thank you for having me. I want to talk to you about some of the things that our group, Arizona United News, does as First Amendment auditors. And so I want to preface, I know you know all about this stuff because this is what you do, but for people watching, First Amendment auditors are a bunch of like-minded patriots that basically go out and test whether or not we've had our rights eroded away by going to places that we believe we're legally allowed to be at, and then we film publicly from that position. And we film anything our eyes can see. We know that we're allowed to be on a spot and you can't trespass your eyes according to the law that we've seen, and I'll ask you more about that. But and we're really not looking for problems. We're not anti-cop. We're not trying to be troublemakers, and a lot of people think we are, and certainly those are the videos that get the most attention, the ones where there's a lot of interaction. But what we're trying to do really is educate, because we truly believe that our rights are being eroded away on a regular basis, and I really do believe there are people out there that would like this to be a police state, where it's a stop and check your papers kind of thing. So, Marc, I'd like to talk to you about some of the things that we encounter when we go out to an audit. So we might go and set up and stand in front of a post office, federal building, police station, whatever, and what almost always happens, first of all, is when we're confronted by a security guard or eventually usually a police officer, we get the show me your ID thing. So can you talk a little about that? It's I think it's 13/24/12, and basically from what I've read, I carry a little card with me so I can actually quote it to them if they want, but I let them know that you can't have my ID, or I can't be charged with not providing ID unless you can say with reasonable articulable suspicion of a crime that I have or am about to commit. Does that make sense? Is that an appropriate statement of the?
Like most things in the law, right? Things are not bright line rules. We don't have a lot of bright line rules, right? So, well, let me first start by saying, I think that if you're going to have a free society, citizens got to be willing to defend it, right?
Absolutely.
If people aren't willing to stand up and defend freedom, not in the middle where everybody agrees on things and nothing's controversial, but on the edges, right? I mean, if you want to defend the First Amendment, you don't do it by defending speech that's not controversial, because nobody cares about that. There's no controversy. Mm-hmm. So that's the somewhat unfortunate part of defending First Amendment liberties, is you're almost always defending very, very unpopular speech. Mm-hmm. And if you're not willing to do that, then I guess you shouldn't get into the business of fighting for freedom. Right. And people need to really make a distinction between stating that the person ought to get to say peacefully whatever they're saying, mm-hmm. and I agree with what they're saying, mm-hmm. right? Because most of the time, when I'm defending someone's right to say something really controversial and extreme, almost always I don't agree with what they're saying. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think that's even a stronger point. I like to make the point sometimes that I completely disagree with the content of what this person is saying, but I support their right to say it.
Right, and we defend it.
Right, of course, that's what we do. That's why we call ourselves the Attorneys for Freedom, because we're not just in favor of the right to do whatever we think is okay. Mm-hmm. It's the right to do whatever you want to do, so long as it's peaceful. Right. I mean, that's the way it ought to be. So if that's really the underlying purpose of what you guys are doing, then I think that's fantastic. So I would start with the idea that you don't get to disturb anybody, right? I think it's a very important point.
Great.
Because as is true in so many other contexts, we fight about the facts. You might say, well, we were standing in a certain place and we weren't disturbing anybody. Somebody else might say, oh no, he was creating a controversy and he was creating a problem, and so it's not the law that's unclear. Of course you get to stand somewhere that's public and not disturb anybody in film, right? That's not a problem under most circumstances, right? Because there's certainly going to be some circumstances where, you know, you may have some high power camera, and even though you're in a public place, well, you're filming into somebody's window,
Right.
and invading their privacy. There could be problems.
There's
there.
statutes for that.
Of course, and so that's why we don't want to make
Yeah.
blanket statements
Right,
in this
right.
area.
Right.
But assuming you're standing in a place outside the police station, let's say in the middle of the day, and you're just turning the camera on the police department or
Right.
something, there's not a problem with that legally, but always keeping in mind that somebody else might say you were doing something different,
Right.
right? You were interfering with the police. So if indeed you're interfering or obstructing or something like that, then that's always gonna be a problem,
Right.
right? So if it's true that you're not interfering, then there really ought to be no problem at all. And that's even filming the police making an arrest or things like that. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, like there are with every rule, but
Right.
generally speaking, if you're standing in a spot and you're not disturbing anybody, and the key part, I think, that gets to your question is, if you're not doing anything that could be considered reasonable suspicion of violating the law. And now this is, again, is a squishy area,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What a police officer or what the law might find is actually reasonable suspicion may not be what you or I think is reasonable suspicion. This is a standard in the law that mostly I haven't really agreed with very much. It's a very, very low standard. Like, for example, sort of the next level up might be something called probable cause. Well, you might think that probable cause is more than 50% likely for something to be probable. But the courts have never said that. In fact, there are some cases that say it doesn't have to be 50% to be probable cause. Now, that doesn't make sense to me.
Right, right.
But I only point this out because what some officer might claim is reasonable suspicion that you're violating the law,
Yeah.
which would then require you to give your true full name, right?
Right.
Right. So the key part here is if the officer has reasonable suspicion to believe that you might be committing some kind of a crime, and you don't know that, right, until after you've litigated the issue in court. But if the officer has reasonable suspicion, then the officer can ask you for your true full name. A lot of
Right.
people think this is identification, you gotta
Right.
pull out a license. It's not what the statute
It
says.
does not. It says full name, no date of birth.
Right.
It just says your full name.
Full name.
Yeah.
And so that's what you have to give, and if
Yeah.
you don't, then the
Yeah.
officer is supposed to tell you, hey, this is a criminal offense. If
Right.
you don't give me your name, we're gonna have a problem.
Right. Now, that's not necessarily true, is it? Because isn't that a secondary offense? Doesn't something have to occur, like you said, that probable cause or that reasonable suspicion? Don't they have to articulate what that was?
They don't have to tell you what the reasonable suspicion is.
Really, they can just
Yeah.
say, I have reasonable suspicion, and they don't have to articulate it to
This
you.
is
and-
something that will be determined later in court,
Oh,
which
okay.
is the squishy. It's kind of
Okay,
like
okay.
people think that the officer's obligated to tell them the reason they pulled them over.
Right, and he's not.
You
That's-
gotta
right.
tell me why you pulled me over.
And they intentionally do not, right? So they
Sometimes
can
they
get your stuff first.
But there's a lot of
Yeah.
discretion for police officers,
Yeah.
right? And this is why some of them come off as jerks.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they want to live in that area that's sort of
Right.
unpopular for us non-police officers,
Yeah.
but they're allowed to do such things.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because it's almost like they treat us like we're the ones being jerks. Because we don't immediately plop out our stuff. I'm sure 99 out of 100 times they ask for somebody's ID, it's like, oh, okay, here you go. And they're so used to that.
Well, I think you gotta be very, very careful and tread lightly when you make these generalizations. When we
Right.
refer to the police as they,
Yeah.
there are very few things that we can say, you know, all police officers this or all police officers that. And I think it's a very important point to make, especially in today's world, right?
Right.
Because we get to see the bad police officers lots of times up close in a video and from a body cam or something that gets retweeted all over the
Right.
internet. Everybody gets to see that, and normally there's no sort of excitement or controversy over a police officer doing something perfectly appropriate, right?
Right.
So we don't normally
Right.
see that.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to gauge. You know, if you said, hey, Mark, you've been doing this 25 years now and you've interacted with a lot of police officers, are they good or are they bad? Well, I of course would say some are good and some are bad. And then someone may ask, well, what percentage are good and what percentage are bad? I don't know.
Yeah.
Very hard to tell.
Yeah.
And when you say bad, does that mean that an officer who maybe made a split-second decision in a tough situation, made the wrong decision,
Right.
does that mean they're bad? Or they just made a bad judgment in this particular, I mean, people aren't generally good or bad, right?
Right.
You do some good things, you do some bad things. Same can be said of me, same can be said of everybody, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard to, to be precise on exactly what we mean. What's a bad cop?
Mhm.
We don't have a clear definition on
Yeah.
that at all.
Yeah, it's not. Okay, well, that makes me think about when you were talking about the police officer asking for our information. Do we, at that point, I want to get maybe into more specifics, more details. If he doesn't tell us that we're being detained for some reason, we do have the right to refuse to ID ourselves, correct?
Not necessarily.
So he can,
Yeah,
he can.
if he's got reasonable suspicion
Mhm.
to believe that you're violating the law, he says, give me what's your name? And you say,
Right.
I'm not giving you my name.
Right.
You could be cited.
Could it be for, can he really just say suspicion? I mean, is that enough for him to,
I don't even think he's gotta say that.
really?
He's gotta say, what's your name?
Uh-huh,
And you say, I'm not giving you my name.
Right.
He says, tell me your name or you're going to jail.
uh-huh,
I'm gonna arrest you. And he may arrest you.
Right,
That's something we gotta sort out later.
right,
Did he have reasonable suspicion that you were violating the law? And
right,
that's something that the officer's gotta get on the stand and testify about.
right,
And that an officer saying, well, I sort of had a hunch, or he looked like a troublemaker, or something like that, that's not gonna cut it.
Mhm.
Whatever reasonable suspicion is,
Yeah.
it's not that. Right, we have other cases. There's a case that the United States Supreme Court decided years ago called Delaware versus Prouse. And in that case, the court specifically said, look, a hunch, that doesn't equate to reasonable suspicion.
right,
You gotta get on the stand and articulate facts that sort of an objective person could listen to and say, yeah, that's reasonable suspicion that he's committing a crime.
Mhm.
Now, keep in mind, this is different if you're driving a motor vehicle, right? If you're driving a motor vehicle, well, now you're in a different world, and you're required to provide your license if you're
Right,
pulled
right.
over. Just while I'm on this point, because a lot of people don't understand this, and I think it's because it probably doesn't make sense, right? But the way our law has evolved is if the officer pulls over the car, even for taillight out or something like that, they can order everybody out of the vehicle. So you might be in the back seat and you may say, look, why do I have to get out of the vehicle?
Right.
I didn't do anything wrong. What's the problem? There's no argument about an officer safety thing that I'm aware of there. But the law's evolved in such a way as to make a bright line rule to say if they make a traffic stop, they can get everybody out of the car. So, sometimes people say, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm not getting out of the car.
right,
This is when things start getting escalated.
sure,
The other thing I think it's important to say here is you really gotta pick your battles.
Yeah.
There are battles all day long we can have if we want.
Yeah.
But you really gotta decide, I would say, sit down and say, do I want to be an activist?
right,
Because if the answer is yes, I wanna be an activist, well then, you gotta be willing to do the kind of things activists do and
Right.
take the kind of heat
Right.
that activists take.
right,
Sometimes you get arrested, sometimes you get charged, sometimes, even if you're in the right,
right,
you may still get arrested, you may still get charged,
right,
you may still have to hire a lawyer, you may still have to spend a bunch of money, go through a trial. Look, you're not the first activist to come in here, right?
right,
Probably I've represented more activists than any other lawyer in the state is my guess.
no doubt,
And sometimes, I've had several cases where we've actually had to go to trial and we've won and people have been acquitted. They didn't do anything wrong in others, but they
Right.
still had to incur all this aggravation.
absolutely, and that's what we tell new auditors, we say, pick your battles. If you really wanna, if you've got a cop that you think is being a tyrant, that you think is violating your rights, and it's all come down to whether you present your ID or not, that's a choice you gotta make, and you make it this way or that way, whatever, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, okay, I'm gonna give you my ID, but I don't agree with what you're doing, because that person incurs all the expense. I mean, it's all things you talked about. There's loss of work, there's loss of wages, there's there's court fees, there's lawyer fees, and it's almost always the case we see that when you talk about, hey, I think you're violating my rights by doing a Terry frisk and all of a sudden you're in my pockets pulling out stuff, you know. Well, they say, well, tell the judge or whatever. They don't care because maybe you can talk a little bit about qualified immunity. They always seem to feel like, yeah, whatever, go ahead and sue me. I don't care, you know, because they're not going to pay for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Sometimes you can go after them personally, and we do.
Doesn't have to be a gross infraction of.
Let's talk about that for a second.
Okay.
So the general rule is that you don't get to sue the sovereign.
Right.
The sovereign is the king. This comes
Yeah.
from the king, right?
Yeah.
Now the sovereign is the state, the federal government or the state government. The general, you don't get to sue them.
Right.
So if you get to sue them, it's because of one reason and one reason only. The sovereign has decided you can sue me. But the sovereign can make all kinds of restrictions. You can sue me. So for example, in Arizona, what I think you're talking about is the sovereign, the state of Arizona has said, well, you can sue for a bad arrest, but you can only sue if there's gross negligence on a bad arrest. That's just the rule they made. Why? Because the king makes the rules, and so the king makes rules that it's hard to sue the king. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to something you said a little bit earlier, and this gets back to really what your definition of a police state is.
Yeah.
It depends. If your definition of a police state is something akin to, look, they can legally, they can mess with me and make my life miserable without violating any laws. If that's your definition of a police state, and it certainly is a reasonable definition to me, then you could just easily say we live in a police state. Because say you're conducting one of these First Amendment audits, and the officer comes out and says, well, what's your name? And you say, look, I don't have to give you my name. Do you have reasonable suspicion I'm doing anything wrong? And the officer says, no, I just want to know your name. And you say, well, I'm not giving you my name. And he says, come on, man, what's the big deal? What's your name? I want to know who you are.
You're trying to hide something.
You're trying to hide something.
Get warrants.
Right, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem?
Yeah.
You stand your guns, and you
Yeah.
say, look, I'm not giving you my truthful name, because you're telling me I haven't done anything to create reasonable suspicion. I don't have to give you, this isn't Nazi Germany, and you don't have to, I don't have to produce my walking papers, or my
Right.
standing papers, or in this case, my filming papers.
Yeah.
Fine. The officer might say, no problem, I'm not gonna create any issues. But when you get in your car and you start driving away, if you're 1 mile an hour over the speed limit,
And you touch the bike lane or
any of countless problems, they can legally pull you over,
Right.
detain you, get you out of your car, get the passengers out of the car. Now they get the license,
Right.
registration, proof of insurance.
Yeah.
They go back, they can run you. A traffic stop is of indeterminate length,
Yeah.
so you could be delayed quite a while. They could pull you over every single day for the same types of problems, legally, right?
Right.
Real problems
Right.
that the law allows them to. So, you have to ask yourself, is this how I want to live my life? And maybe it is.
Yeah.
Fighting the government, doing these kinds of things may be what you choose to do. On the other hand, there are many different battles, and I would say probably more pressing issues. I mean, for example, we got over 2 million people in prison. Many of them are our brothers and sisters
Right.
are there for non-violent drug
Minor
offenses.
drug arrest. Yeah.
Even if they're major, even if they're sales of 1,000 pounds of marijuana, I put that in exactly the same category as the guy with one joint.
Yeah.
It's a non-violent crime. That person is living in a cage, to me, is probably the biggest moral outrage of our day.
Yeah.
We got our brother and sister human beings rotting away in cages right now
Right.
on victimless crimes, and it's not just drugs. We got a case in this office right now on gambling. We get prostitution cases in here. We get ridiculous little
Right.
gun offenses that are technical. The barrel of your firearm was a ½ an inch too short.
Yeah.
Ridiculous little things like that. So, to me, if I have limited time in the day,
Yeah.
right? And to me, that's a bigger issue.
Sure.
Not that I'm intending to diminish the importance of the issue.
I gotta get out of here then.
No, I'm not intending to, because
Understand.
people are wired different ways. It
Sure.
may be something you enjoy.
Sure,
You may get
sure.
certain enjoyment out
Sure.
of the First Amendment.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
perfectly fine.
Yeah.
You should do it in a way that represents us peaceful people
Yeah.
properly. Don't be a jerk. You don't
Right.
have to swear and scream and yell. You may be dealing with a great peace officer.
Yeah, I
Who's
agree.
maybe legitimately concerned. I mean, don't we want police officers to come out and say, there's a guy out there doing something weird.
Absolutely.
Maybe he's not violating the law that we can tell, but let's go out there and see what's up.
Yeah.
I think we want police officers to
Yeah,
do that.
absolutely. And that's the thing, when they come out and approach us, boy, the first 30 seconds tell the whole story.
Sure
From after
does.
that, we try and let them know. I know they come out and they're doing a threat assessment, basically. They're looking,
Yes.
is this guy a threat to what's going on here? I'm checking him out, I'm looking at his demeanor, I'm looking him over. Has he got bags on, backpacks, whatever, something on his face? And we tell our folks, let them know that you're a journalist collecting information, footage for a story, that for future consumption by the public.
Why not say, I'm a First Amendment auditor, and I'm standing here on a public place,
Right,
testing First Amendment rights of freedom of the
Yeah.
press, and if you think I'm doing something wrong, let me know, because I certainly don't wanna violate the law, but that's what I'm doing.
right.
Why not just say that?
Yeah, I know, and some of the guys do that, but I think it almost kind of tips your hand as to, and it might make him react differently
Maybe, yeah.
than if he, that's why we go unannounced, they always come and say, well, why didn't you talk to the guards, or we'd be happy to take you on a tour of the, Northrop Grumman if you want to, instead of standing out here.
Yeah,
But I think what we're trying to find out is just a person doing that First Amendment protected activity, what's gonna happen when he does it in a public place? It just seems, in this, and I'm gonna use the term, this day and age, we always hear that, in this day and age, we gotta worry about what you're doing, you're collecting data or whatever. It just seems like the cameras just scare the living hell out of people. And in the life of me, I don't really understand why.
well, I think if somebody stood outside on the public sidewalk in front of your house,
Yeah,
and put a camera up,
sure,
and started filming from the sidewalk, not peering in the windows,
Yep.
just a general, I can tell you, I walk outside and
Sure.
say, what are you doing?
and we're fine with that, and I understand that, and the police officers often bring that up. Well, how would you like it if we stood outside your house, I say, well, this isn't your house, this is a government building, whatever, I am on a public sidewalk, I told you what I'm doing, I have no ill intent. And then it seems like after that, depending on the officer, of course, but then they go on a fishing expedition. What are you doing? How'd you get here? Where's your car? Because they want that connection. They know that as a pedestrian, they have very little they can do if you're not breaking the law, but you're right, once you get in the car, you're sunk, so.
Yeah, once, if you give them information, again, this is a general statement, but the more specific situation I'm thinking about is, I remember when Obama was coming to town, and some of the freedom guys in town were gonna have a protest, and they were gonna bring their firearms. And they called Phoenix PD and said, look, we're gonna have a protest, we are bringing our firearms to the rally for the president. And Phoenix PD said, no problem.
Really?
No problem. And they brought AR-15s, and they stood there while Obama spoke, and it made news. It made
And the
national
Secret
news,
Service had no issue with that.
because they weren't breaking the law.
Wow.
But I think had that occurred without the prior notice,
Yeah,
right? A
yeah.
bunch of guys just show up with
Yeah.
AR-15s, and the president said, it's gonna be a different situation.
Yeah,
I think that probably reasonableness should be our most
Right.
important word, right? I mean,
right,
there has to be a balance between law enforcement and sort of liberty.
yeah.
There has to be a balance, right? We want police officers being suspicious. That's the nature of the job, right?
Sure.
Because if they're not, imagine some guy out in front of the police department with a camera, nobody goes out, does anything, and he explodes a bomb and people die.
Right.
And then somebody says, well, you didn't even go out and say, what's the guy doing?
Right.
Confront him, talk to him, take
Yeah.
his temperature and what's going on. We would be critical of the police in that case, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that we need to be a little bit probably more tolerant on both sides of understanding the sort of nuances here. We had a situation recently in Arizona where, I think it was Arizona, where DCS failed to take action and remove a kid from the house, and something horrible happened. I think the kid was killed or something. Terrible story. But now there's a hot potato, right, where there are two sides.
Sure.
DCS, if they act too quickly and they take the kids out of the house, everybody's outraged.
Right,
The
right,
government's
right.
snatching kids and there's a huge
Sure,
problem.
sure.
If they don't act quickly enough and they leave the kid in the house and something bad happens, then you get the stories we saw, I think it was last week, which is, why didn't DCS act? Why didn't they take more action? So it's a really tough situation to be in, because every situation's different. We wanna look at it carefully. None of us agree on at what point exactly should the kids be removed from the parents, right? We all have sort of a different construction on when that ought to happen. Some people might say it should never happen under any circumstances, although I think that seems pretty unreasonable to me. So it's a very difficult job, and I think, and I'm not here to defend cops. I'm tough on cops when we need to be tough on them, and I defend them when we need to defend them. It's a tough job. They gotta make quick decisions, and they get a lot of blame, and deadly forces involved,
Sure.
and people make, there's hard decisions to make when you don't have all the information.
Yeah, great point. Talk a little about Terry v. Ohio and how that comes into play when you're out there and somebody is auditing a place, just filming, and they went to invoke a Terry stop.
All right, so you have to go back really to the Fourth Amendment to understand what's going on.
Right.
We talk about the Fourth Amendment a lot, and people know, the Fourth Amendment, but not everybody really carefully reads the thing. But in essence, it protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. There's other parts about warrants as well.
Right.
But the key word there is unreasonable.
Right.
Said another way, and I like to say it sort of inversely. The Fourth Amendment means, this is the Marc Victor's definition, the Fourth Amendment means the government can search or seize anyone or anything at any time it sees fit for any reason whatsoever, so long as the government decides that what the government did was reasonable. Right?
Yeah.
That's your great Fourth Amendment protection.
Yeah.
So it all is going to turn on one thing. It's going to turn on what the 9 people wearing black robes at the United States Supreme Court decide is reasonable. Okay. So with that backdrop, the question that arises, when a police officer detains somebody, it's not an arrest, it's something in between you're free to go and you're under arrest, put the cuffs on. It's a brief detention. It's, hold on a second, I'm going to ask you some questions.
Right.
That's called a Terry stop. The reason we call it a Terry stop is because the court laid out the contours of what can be done in that interaction in Terry versus Ohio. So we call it a Terry stop.
Right.
What the court decided there was that if the officer has reasonable suspicion of a crime, then the officer can briefly detain you for purposes of determining what's going on. The officer has to believe there's reasonable suspicion of a crime and that you were the person involved in the crime. If the officer, and this is, by the way, this is one of my pet peeves in doing criminal defense, because people think of the Terry stop as the Terry stop and frisk. They think that if the officer has reasonable suspicion to believe a crime is afoot, as they said in the Terry case, and that you might be the person involved, they automatically get to detain you and automatically get to frisk you.
Doesn't that also include a prerequisite that they think you are armed?
Yes, and that's where I'm going.
Oh, okay.
And so the court was pretty clear to delineate the Terry frisk from the Terry stop.
Okay.
The Terry frisk is in the event that the officer has reasonable suspicion to think you are armed and dangerous. Not just armed.
Or.
Not just armed.
Yeah.
Because if armed was enough, they wouldn't have to say armed and dangerous.
Right.
So they would just have said armed. But some officers believe, maybe reasonably so because of the way our cases have developed over the years, that anytime they get to stop you under Terry, they also get to frisk you. And now the frisk, to break that down a little bit, this isn't a search of the pockets and open up this and that.
Right.
This is a pat down of the outer layers of clothing. And the purpose of the pat down is to determine if you've got weapons or things like that that could be a danger to the police officer. But as cases evolve, right, when the officer is frisking you for guns or something or a knife, and the officer feels something that, hey, this feels, in my experience, this sort of feels like illegal drugs, marijuana, cocaine or something, is the officer reasonably required to say, I'm supposed to just ignore this? No. The court has said, well, if it's immediately apparent to the officer as he's doing his Terry frisk, well, now he can reach in and grab it. So the question is that unreasonable? Is any of this unreasonable?
Right.
It seems to me that we want to have police able to detain people, don't we?
Sure.
Because if they can't detain people, we may as well not have cops.
Right.
And do we want to let them detain anybody willy-nilly? No. Do we wanna say they gotta have enough for an arrest to detain somebody? Probably not.
Right.
So I think it makes sense to have sort of a middle standard,
Mhm.
to say reasonable suspicion. I think the problem is, we gotta have real reasonable suspicion, right? It can't be this sort of, anything is sort of possible, and I think the
Yeah.
courts have sort of allowed that to get a little bit broad in their zeal for sort of pro-law enforcement. It's not about being pro-law enforcement or anti-law enforcement, it's about what should the proper balance be in a free society. Because
Right.
we wanna get bad guys as defined as somebody who violates the non-aggression principle.
Mhm.
And if you don't know what the non-aggression principle is, we don't have enough time to go into it here, but people should Google it and check it out and spend a little time thinking about the non-aggression principle.
Right,
'Cause
right.
we pro-freedom people,
Yeah.
we don't see a crime unless the non-aggression principle is violated, right?
Right.
So in all victimless crimes, there's non-aggression principle is not violated, therefore we don't see a crime there. So anyways, I don't think it's unreasonable for the officer who's now in proximity to this person, if they have reasonable grounds that they can articulate to say, this person is not just armed, because lots of people are armed,
Mhm.
but also dangerous, a threat to me.
Mhm.
Okay, fine, if they have that and they can articulate that. Now, the law's gone even further, because we have a statute now in Arizona that says the officer can also ask you the question, do you have a concealed firearm? You gotta answer that question truthfully, so much for the right to remain silent.
Mhm.
And if the answer is yes, the officer can actually take the firearm and hold it for the pendency of
For
this.
officer safety.
Yeah, see, I think that's gone much too far.
Mhm.
Because now what you have, first of all, I think you got a violation of the right to remain silent
Right.
when the officer asks you and the law requires you to answer that question. And then second, I don't know what possibly justifies a police officer for taking the firearm. Because this is a taking without due process in my view.
Right.
Even though it's a firearm, it's not worth that much, maybe. And even though it's a very short duration of time, sorry, to me that's part of life. As citizens that you police, some of them have guns.
Right.
And I don't think they should be allowed to take the guns just because they're aware there's a gun there and they're in some kind of a traffic stop. That seems
Right.
unreasonable to me.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court says, and this hasn't gone to the Supreme Court, but imagine it did, they may say, well, Mark, we just disagree with you, we think that's reasonable. And that's really all you get out of the Fourth Amendment.
Mhm.
As long as they've decided it's reasonable,
Right.
then it's permissible.
Right, right. Does that bother you that something like that can go all the way up to the decision of one particular person? I mean, isn't that,
No, because first of all, we got 9 people on the court. They
Right.
could split 4-4,
Sure.
it could be one person that makes the decision. But at some point, we gotta have a decision.
yeah,
Right,
yeah,
we gotta,
exactly.
we gotta have some rules for cops to follow and
Right.
citizens to know, so life can roll forward. So we gotta make a decision. I don't think there's only one possible decision, which is why, I've said in many contexts, I think free societies can have different rules.
Mhm.
I think there's a very broad sort of basket of what's reasonable in interacting with cops and citizens, and
Sure.
we need to have that interaction, right? Because we all recognize there really are bad guys.
Right.
There are people who would steal your property and violate the non-aggression principle. I don't wanna fight all of them off, you don't wanna fight, you make films and do First Amendment on it, we're not in the business of chasing bad guys down.
Right.
And maybe we don't run as fast as we used to run, so we have our agents to help us with that.
Mhm.
They're our agents. We need to remember that the government works for us.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the
In
times
theory.
you'll hear, yeah, a lot of times we'll say that, you work for me, and boy, that sets some of them off.
They
really.
don't wanna hear that.
Yeah. You talked about the right to remain silent. I wanted to ask you specifically, in an interaction with the police, at what point, let's say we go from the reasonable suspicion to the probable cause, maybe detainment to arrest, when do we say, I'm done talking to you, I'm calling Mark?
This is one of those areas that I think that you really gotta use your own judgment, right?
Okay.
Because cops run a spectrum.
Yeah.
From one end, hi, how are you today? What's going on? Anything I can help with? That kind of thing. To,
Right.
what are you doing on my road?
Right,
With the
absolutely.
hand on the firearm.
It's like I said, the first 30 seconds determines
Yes.
the whole episode.
I always tell people, when you're having an interaction with not just a police officer, but anybody from the government, really, and not just from the government, but really anybody. If you meet someone on the street, right?
Mhm.
I think the initial impression that is made is very important. And so I think we all ought to be sort of on guard and have our sort of antenna up and just be more aware of our circumstances and make judgments about things, keeping those judgments open because we got limited data at the beginning, right?
Right.
So I think a lot of your question depends on how the first 30 seconds or 1 minute goes, right? Because you may get a wonderful police officer, no problems, nothing really to worry about. You could get a bad guy, you could also get a sneaky police officer, but I think at the time they're putting those new bracelets on your wrist, at the time the officer says, hey, you're under arrest, at the time the officer is reading from their department issue card, you know, your Miranda warnings, your right to remain silent. In fact, the second part I think is really most important. Anything you say will be used against you. If you really think about that line,
Yeah.
and if you've heard it and you're thinking about it, that's a good time to shut up, right? That's a good.
Something you've said in the videos is don't be your own worst enemy.
I wrote an article with that title.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it
I
makes
think-
perfect sense. You cannot help yourself at that point
Yeah,
by
I
saying
mean,
anything, can
At
you?
the time the officer has put the cuffs on you, they've made a decision that I
Right.
got probable cause to believe a crime has been committed and you're the guy who's committed it. You're
Right,
not gonna talk them out of that.
right,
You
right.
got plenty of time to make a statement later, but I think at that point you got a free ride at least to the police station. Now, not being a jerk can still help you, because in Arizona, on a misdemeanor case, they can cite and release you,
Yeah.
or they could book you into jail. And
Right.
the case is the same for you, and you probably prefer to be cited and released.
Right.
This is one of those areas that I can almost guarantee you, if you're a jerk, if you're, you're annoying the police officer, they're gonna book you into jail because they have that discretion.
Right.
As they say, you might beat the rap, but you can't beat the ride. They're gonna give you a ride to the jailhouse, right?
That's absolutely true, yeah. Okay,
Common sense, really.
yeah. But I mean, I guess I just wanted to reiterate, to some people, I totally agree with you. I don't see there's anything you can really say that's gonna help your case at that point. Trying to explain your way out of it, trying to do this or that, so.
Well, plus, as I've
Yeah.
explained on many other occasions in other places, there are many other problems here, right?
Yeah,
Just because you say something doesn't mean that the officer's gonna write that down accurately.
Right.
I've had many cases where my client has said something and the officer wrote down something inaccurate. How do I know? Because even in cases where the interaction was recorded, the officer still wrote things down incorrectly. So, I mean, you gotta be very, very careful, right? Plus, you might say something that, you might have said something not entirely accurate, just unintentionally. You weren't entirely precise. People speak in ways where they're not totally precise. And what you say, even if the officer writes it down accurately, this could be used against you a year or 2 years later when your case goes to trial, and some prosecutors now hanging on every word that you said, which now you want to shade a little differently because you've had a year to think about it.
Right, okay. Let me switch gears a little bit. Let's talk a little about trespassing. It's something that we run across all the time. We find that doing a First Amendment audit, inevitably, the security guard or the property owner, they believe that their property line runs all the way out to the street. They always think that. And we know that there has to be some type of easement there for the public. And we do check, we look on the county assessor's map here in Maricopa, and we can find that line. And it's usually 30 to 60 feet sometimes away from it. What is the rule that allows them to say we're trespassing, or to tell the police that, and then where do they fall as far as determining that? Is that just a judgment call from the cop?
No, a trespass isn't a judgment call.
Okay.
What you need to know for a trespass, and remember, you've got two different varieties of trespasses. You have your criminal trespass,
Right.
and you have your civil trespass. Your
Right,
civil
right.
trespass, we're not really worried about here, right?
Mhm.
Because you're not gonna get sued likely for a civil trespass
Right.
if there's no damage, is not
Right.
likely. I haven't seen any lawsuits like that. You stepped on my property and then I'm gonna sue you and I want damages.
Right.
Not likely to happen.
Right.
The criminal trespass requires knowledge. You can't accidentally trespass there. And so normally what happens, it'll say you enter unlawfully,
Right.
or you knowingly enter unlawfully, or you remain unlawfully.
Okay, those
So-
are important. The
Yeah, those
remain and
are
the-
two slightly different differences, right?
Right.
So, say you come to my house and you're uninvited, and you know you're uninvited, and you open the door and you know you're not supposed to do it, and you walk in, that's a criminal trespass. There's no question about that. You
Right,
if,
right.
you know, if you made a mistake and you thought, oh, I thought, you know, I'm visiting from out of town, I thought this was my friend's house, but it turns out it's not, and I made a horrible mistake, you're probably fine there on criminal trespass until somebody says leave.
Okay,
Now you know,
okay,
and you say, I'm not leaving. Even if you were invited. Say, I invite you to my house. Say I decide to invite you for the third week of the football season to watch the Patriots play the Jets.
yeah.
And you're a Jets fan, let's just say, and I'm a Patriots
I see
fan.
where this is going.
And I bring you to the house and give you popcorn or whatever
Yeah,
I give
yeah.
you, and as it turns out, the unthinkable is occurring and the Jets are beating the Patriots.
Right,
And you're
right.
getting uppity and I'm unhappy, and let's just say I'm a horrible sport, which
Absolutely.
is not the case. But I say, hey, I'm done with you. It's time for you to leave. And you say, no, Mark, you invited me here to watch the game, and it's only the third quarter or whatever, and I'm staying. That's a criminal trespass,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because your status, your right to enter my property under the law is something called a licensee. You have it's almost like buying a ticket to go to a sporting event.
Okay.
It's sort of it's called a license,
Right.
actually. You have a
Until it's revoked, right?
it can be revoked at any time, yes.
Right, right.
So, if you're stepping over the line
Mhm,
and you did it intentionally, you're gonna have a problem.
mhm.
If you're stepping over the line accidentally and somebody says, hey, you realize this is actually my property where you're standing, you say, oh, I'm
Yeah,
so sorry,
yeah.
I'm leaving, you're not gonna have any problems.
Well, let's drill down a little more to that. What about public property? What about post offices? What about city utility areas?
Public property kind of fouls everything up, does it? Because
Yeah.
saying everybody owns it is really the same thing as saying nobody owns it, isn't it?
Okay,
And
yeah.
we've got signs here in Arizona that I noticed years ago that say, state property, no trespass.
Right, and who's the state?
Who owns it?
We do.
I mean, it's
It's my property. That's why they say, why are you filming my post office? That's my post office.
so many problems could be
Yeah.
resolved in our world
Right.
with less public property or no public property, and all
Absolutely.
private.
Yeah, but do you know any specifics on, you know, post office? The reason I mention that is we had an auditor arrested a couple of weeks ago who was auditing a post office. And they have a document that if you go into the post office, they have a big, they call it poster 7 is what it is. And in that is a little block that says, public photography is allowed in lobbies, foyers, unless, you know, stated by the postmaster or some other descriptions. But when you have something like that, you can actually show them that that's what it says. It really doesn't matter. If they say you need to go, you need to go, right? I mean, can they supersede that particular, no, that's a, very
That's
specific.
something that's gonna have to be litigated. I
Yeah,
think. Because you could imagine some sort of low-level person over there that says, hey, you need to leave.
right,
So the postmaster general has said, no problem with filming here.
right,
You
right,
may actually still have permission.
yeah,
But I think that's an issue that would have to be litigated. I'd want to know
Yeah.
more about the facts and circumstances. And maybe this
Yeah.
one, where your person did get arrested for trespassing at the post office, that'd be a great case to push and find out exactly what the contours are there.
right.
And I think it's gonna turn on who told them to leave, and what the
Yeah.
rules were, and those kinds
Yeah.
of things.
It turned out that they added a bunch of charges, didn't they, Alex? They added other charges other than trespass. They added fighting, disorderly conduct. They threw all this
Well, but
ridiculous
see,
stuff
there
on there.
again, there you go with the facts, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
they're gonna say, well, we didn't ask him to leave because he was filming. He can
Right.
certainly come here and film, no problem.
yeah,
We asked him to leave because he was being disruptive.
right. And sometimes disruptive is somebody else is uncomfortable with you being in there,
Yeah,
even though you did nothing.
and that's the kind of thing I think should be litigated.
Right,
I think that's
right.
reasonable. But you know, in terms of what a trespass is, there's a lot of very, very good thinking over the years that's gone into what exactly a trespass is. I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at the cases will say you can have a trespass of smells, you can have a trespass of sound, you can have a trespass of, you know, particles, all those things.
Right.
So normally, no, I don't believe there are any cases that say it's a trespass to certainly look, because you're not pushing anything on the property.
Right.
You're receiving the light that's coming off
Right.
the property.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind that many of these trespasses are what we call de minimis. And I think it's very important, because life is filled with trespasses.
De minimis.